Welcome to Conversations from the Collection, a Newcastle Art Gallery podcast. This podcast was produced on the land of the Awabakal and Worimi people. We pay our deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm your host, Zana Kobayashi, and each episode will be diving into a new collection area of the Newcastle Art Gallery to uncover hidden stories from artists who have contributed to the significance of our diverse collection. In this first episode, we speak with pioneering female Australian artist Virginia Cuppaidge, who has 5 works in the Newcastle Art Gallery collection. On a rainy spring morning, we were invited to Virginia's beautiful Art Deco apartment. Fabulous. Oh, there we go. Hello. Okay? Yes, yeah, we do. She now lives and works in Newcastle. This is a stunning place to live. How long have you been here for now?
Nearly 5 years. In fact, more than 5 years. It's incredible. I don't realise I've been here that long.
And we sat down in her living room for a conversation that traversed her time in New York, her relationship to feminism, and her changing identity as an Australian artist. You will hear Virginia refer to 3 distinct series within her career. Her 1970s geometric series that used hard-edge abstraction techniques, her 1980s Sky Space series where Virginia developed a new method for applying paint, and her 1990s series Nature of Painting that evolved with bright, bold colours. I loved this conversation with Virginia. She is an incredibly generous storyteller, and I felt like I was walking the streets of New York with her. Virginia began our conversation by telling us about her upbringing in a creative household in Brisbane during the late 1940s and early 1950s, and how this led to her very early commitment to a career as an artist.
Yes, very creative household. My mother was an artist. She was a botanical artist. And at that stage when I was quite little, she wasn't practicing, she was just doing drawings. But she had a studio in the back of the house where I lived. And I would witness her in the studio, see her painting away. And I loved that atmosphere from when I was very little. And I can remember, it turns out, when I was about 6, I decided that's what I wanted to do when I got old. And also, they had a selection of Australian paintings, mainly Australian artists, on the walls contemporary. We had John Malvick's, who's a Queensland artist. And as I was growing up, sort of around teenage years, I really started to appreciate those paintings. And I was just very drawn to the idea of making paintings. And then they would get magazines from overseas. They'd get Look magazine and the New Yorker magazine. And in Look magazine, they had big articles on the abstract expressionists. This is when I was about 13. And they just, inspired me. And I think I sort of thought abstractly from an early age because I really connected to them, but I knew that they were difficult. I knew there was more to find out about them too, like they weren't just straightforward. And it was sort of later when I had been to boarding school meantime. I came back to Brisbane for a year. Then I moved to Sydney for 5 years and I studied at the Mary White School of Art. It was during that time that I decided that I'd go to New York to sort of adventure out there.
So when you were at the Mary White School of Art, that was in about 1965,
60s,
is that
yes.
right? You were studying along contemporaries
Yes.
like John Olsen and Robert Klippel.
Yes.
What was it like living in Sydney at that time?
Well, I absolutely loved it. I had a little business doing hand-printed fabrics, which wasn't very successful financially, but it was keeping my time. But
That's
again,
Virginia Prince, is that right?
Virginia Prince, yes, called Virginia Prince. And
what kind of prints were you making through that business?
I was printing on silk. We were doing silk clothes, and we eventually turned them into clothes. We had a little factory. We were making clothes out of them, and very sort of mod from that era, from the 1960s era. And I thought they were very good, but there was definitely a niche market, you know.
Have you kept any of them?
I've kept some of the fabrics, yes, I have.
Great.
And occasionally I bump into someone who's still saved a dress from that era, you know.
Oh, I love it.
And but when all that sort of didn't work out, I decided now's the time for me to go to New York. And I just up very hurriedly and made a decision that I was going to go. I'd never travelled before. I'd never been on an overseas flight or anything like that. And I was very, looking back on it, completely unorganised. I just was going to get on a plane and see what I could do, you know.
I've heard at that time you told your friends, I'm not moving to America, I'm moving to New York.
That's right.
And well, what did you mean by that?
Well, the thing was, at that stage, at that time, a lot of the Australian artists were recognised by Brian Robertson, who was a curator of the Whitechapel Gallery in London, and he had travelled to Australia, and he had recognised Drysdale, Dobell, all those artists of that era, and took them back to England and established them there. And so a lot of artists were travelling to London. And for some reason, I just knew, no, that wasn't for me. That was sort of a whole different thing. I was going straight to New York, and so I basically said, I'm not going to America, I'm going to New York.
Now, you have an amazing story that I've heard you tell about arriving in New York with a suitcase,
One suitcase,
a pink satin miniskirt, and a scrap of paper with a phone number on it. Can you take us through your first day in New York?
Well, it was really extreme, the experience, because when I was flying into New York, and I asked the woman who was sitting next to me, did she know of an inexpensive hotel? And my father had warned me, he said, you can't just go to New York without booking a hotel. And I said, well, I don't know when I'm going to get there and what I'm going to do, so I'll just leave it. And she gave me the name of this hotel on the Lower East Side that turned out it was a welfare hotel, and it was really for transient people. It wasn't a proper hotel. And because I was late at night, I stayed there, and it was really horrible, a horrible experience. Cockroaches running everywhere and just, you know, no running water. It was really incredible. And I had one telephone number of someone in New York I knew. And the next day I got up and I walked down the street in a straight line. There were no phones in the hotel, no phones in the room or anything like that. And to find a phone box that I could call Clement Meadmore, who was the one number I had. And I'd met Clem once in Australia, but he'd been living over there for about 10 years and having success finally. And he said, I need an assistant. Do you want to rent a room here? Because I'd asked him where to stay. And I said, sure. And so that started out my first day in New York. And then when I got up to the flat, he said to me, put down your suitcase. We're going downtown to see an Andy Warhol movie.
Amazing.
And so I put down my suitcase and off we went. This was the beginning of a very tumultuous, amazing time I had with Clem. And we went downtown, and there was this Andy Warhol movie, an 8-hour, 3-minute long movie going of Andy Warhol with a camera just held on the top of the Empire State Building, sort of focused on the top of the Empire State Building, not on top of it literally. And I just thought, this is amazing, you know, this is just happening, you know, just with a few people around. And that was the first day.
Did you stay for the whole 8 hours?
No, we only made it for a couple of hours.
It's such an amazing way to travel or go to a new place. We have so much access now in terms of being able to research where to go or,
exactly,
you know, book things online. The idea of just turning up to a city with a scrap of paper is such a foreign idea to me.
Well, it is, I think. And I mean, it was only just my nature, I guess, a bit of a wild one then, anyway.
I bet. You have said that you spent your first year in New York just visiting galleries, and you actually didn't start painting until your second year.
That's right.
Was that something that you did intentionally?
No, no. What happened is, when I got there, to be honest, I was overwhelmed. And I would never admit that to anyone, that I was overwhelmed, but I was. It was just so extreme. There were so many galleries and so many people, and every day just walking down the street There was a lot of drugs, a lot of heroin on the streets of New York. This drug dealer had come up in the 70s and turned it into a very dangerous city. We had a welfare hotel opposite where we were living, and there were heroin addicts shooting up on the street. You go to work and they'd just be there, and it's like, you know, the city was very feeling like that, and I was actually terrified of it, you know. But what happened was, we would go to parties and we'd go to places, and he took me around all the shows. It was every week we'd go around and see different shows. And people kept saying to me, isn't New York the most wonderful place, and isn't it terrific, and isn't it this and that? And I just kept thinking, they know something that I don't know, because I'm scared, but they're not. And gradually, I did adjust to it in a funny way. You get used to the extremes, and you get used to differentiating between the extremes and not getting emotionally involved in every little aspect. So gradually it sort of wore me down. And meantime, Clem and I got together as partners eventually. And it was a wonderful time because we talked about art all day and all night. When we weren't listening to jazz, he had this incredible jazz collection, and I love jazz. And I decided I wasn't ready to make paintings because I was just absorbing everything, you know. And then in the back of the kitchen there was a little pantry which we turned into a studio, and I started to make these small paintings on canvas of some very, what I call now, the geometric work that I do. Then gradually I got a studio on West 52nd Street in the Hell's Kitchen area of New York, a great big old dusty garage that had been cleaned out and refurbished, and I had this studio for about 2 years. And then I started on really big canvases because I could buy the big canvas. You couldn't get big canvas like that in Australia. Looking back on it, I must have had a very clear vision, but I didn't feel like that. It was all new to me.
And how did your career begin to take shape in New York?
Well, when I produced this body of work after about 1.5 years, I started to go around galleries. And again, you know, you can see a lot of galleries, a lot of rejection. You know, they've never heard of you and you just go around. But I was taken on by a gallery on 57th Street, which is where all the major galleries were at that time. This is way before the years of Soho, when the art world had moved down there in the mid-70s, but this was early 70s. And in 73, I had my first show in New York at the Abe Sachs Gallery. It was really terrific, but they said to me when I had the first show, they said, now beware, you won't sell anything because nobody knows who you are, but you've got to show somewhere. That was refuted by the fact on the first morning a stranger or someone from outside from the street just walked in, saw the show and liked the painting and bought a painting.
Oh my goodness.
So that was very good. So that was a good start. When I finally moved down to Soho and got my own studio there, the work was changing a little bit, and I ended up showing at Susan Corwell Gallery in Soho, which was a great big huge white walls and big high ceilings and great for showing big work. And when I was doing this geometric work, it was very sort of rectangles top and bottom of the painting and very soft area painted in between. And I became more interested in the soft area in between, just space.
Yes.
And probably because I had a fantastic view from my loft that I had in Soho facing south. I could see one of the World Trade Center buildings from where I was. There was a lot of light coming in, and I developed this technique of changing colours across the canvas. And
this was the Sky Space series, isn't
the
that
Sky
right?
Space series, yes.
Yes, which is, I guess, such a prominent epoch within your career.
Well, this is the thing, and the Sky Space paintings I dropped the rectangle idea and I just opened up the space, and I had a few just little shapes working in the space, sort of to create a certain amount of tension. I was very interested in the minimal art movement in New York was in full flush. It was really, painters were really doing it up well. And I was terribly influenced by that in a funny way, more than the abstract expressionists that I had seen. And I just thought it was wonderful that they had a minimal amount of information, but a sort of a maximal amount of emotion going on. And I was really interested in that.
Was this the series that was described by some American audience as being very Australian?
Yes.
And at the time that you didn't like that description?
Well, at the time, I wanted to be international. I thought, you know, here I've come all the way from Australia and I'm painting in New York and I'm living in New York. Isn't this wonderful? And I want to be described as an international artist. But I discovered and learned very early that art is local and that they recognised Australian colours, apparently, in my work, which I've grown to understand, but at the time I didn't. I thought, what's the difference? But it really is different light and it's different colours when they come back here. But in the end, I embraced it. I thought, why not? Be proud.
To give you a point of difference in the in the crowd.
Yes.
Can you talk to me a little bit more about the Australian light in comparison to the light in New York? What
Well, the thing about the light in New York, probably because it's on a sort of a harbour and it's on the edge of sort of cooler weather upstate New York, the skies were rarely blue. They were always sunny, but sort of silvery skies like cloud cover. And there's nothing more divine than a blue sky day in New York because it's rare. And so even in the summer when it gets really hot, it's sort of not misty, but sort of just slightly cloudy looking. Sun coming through clouds, very humid. And the light out here was so clear. And the other thing that I felt I was influenced by, coming from Queensland, is that the light up there, in a funny way, is so hot and so shiny in a way, sometimes it bleaches the colour out of colours, if you know what I mean, and when you're looking at it. And even though it's clear, it takes a lot of the brightness away. And so I think my colours tend to be rather soft rather than stark. And I think that's a definite influence from growing up in Queensland and being in that environment.
During the 1980s, you contributed to the groundbreaking and iconic Guerrilla Girls. Can you tell us a bit about the group and what was your involvement?
Well, my involvement was really as a contributing person to the Guerrilla Girls because it started up in the 1980s. But I had been probably more involved with the feminist group when I first went to New York in the early 70s. A friend of mine, Corinne Robbins, who was an art critic, and she invited me into the feminist group that she was belonging to. And she wrote a very interesting book called The Pluralist Era. And she talked about work in the late 70s and the 1980s when women particularly were coming up on the sort of the back of what we'd done in the early 70s of protesting to museums that they didn't have enough women and so on. We went to Washington, D.C. to march on, Women's Day to make sure that there was more art by women shown in public places. And this book was talking about women, including myself, who were not doing the latest trendy thing. They were just painting their own vision. And that was, in a way, it was sort of a back-to-front freedom that women had because there was so little attention on them that they just could do what they wanted. But they were taking advantage of it. But by the 1980s, the feminist movement had sort of piped down a bit. And so there was a need for something to spring up. So there came the Guerrilla Girls, and they, of course, got in the guerrilla suits so they couldn't be identified because a lot of them were very established artists and they wanted everyone to join in and feel equal. And so it went,
Did you contribute anonymously or as under your own name?
No, I contributed under my own name, and I am considered as one of the forerunners of it because of that.
Absolutely. What is your relationship to feminism as an artist?
Well, I think I can relate to feminist and the feminist struggles that women have had as artists because I do think that women have been underrepresented. But at the same time, having said that, it's made me feel very independent and just work in my own idiom and the way I work. It's given me that freedom in a funny way, even though it's a detriment. It's given me a freedom. And I think there's more right now, particularly with the Me Too movement and the National Gallery putting on that show.
Know My Name.
Know My Name exhibition.
Yes.
I think it's been a great improvement with people like that and directors like Nick Michvich who can recognise that problem. And so women are getting a good look in now, I think. that's on the back of all the work we did, I think, the feminist groups did. I don't think it would have happened out of the blue. In fact, it wouldn't have happened out of the blue.
No, I agree. You ultimately spent 40 years in New York.
Yes, I did.
And how do you think this affected your relationship or your identity as an Australian? And did you ever feel like a real New Yorker, or were you always the Australian in New York?
Well, in a way, I'm never sure of that, because I probably should answer that by saying I felt like the Australian in New York, even though I was trying not to be. People certainly identified me as that. And they say, unless you grew up in New York, you're not a New Yorker anyway. You can be living there for years and years and years.
Yes.
But I always felt very much part of the Australian art world, and I was showing my work here continuously through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. I was showing back in Australia. So, you know, that was very much connecting me, you know.
How did you maintain that relationship with Australia?
I had galleries approach me about showing my work, and I showed my work in Gallery A, which was the only gallery at that time showing abstract work in Sydney and Melbourne. They had a gallery in Melbourne. And my work was well received. That's the other thing, that it was very well received.
So in 2017, you decided to return to Australia, and your survey exhibition was held at Newcastle Art Gallery in 2019. Why did you choose Newcastle to settle in, and what was it like exhibiting your work to this audience here?
Well, the reason why I ended up in Newcastle was partly because I had family here. My brother and his wife and their 2 nephews are here. And I was on my way to get a flat in Sydney, because that's where I have friends there. And I decided to just stay here for a little while to sort of see my nephews. My nephews were just about to leave home at that age, and I thought I'll spend a little bit more time than usual with them, because I'd been only visiting them when I came back to Australia each other year or something. And the more I stayed here, the more I liked it. People were so friendly, and it was easygoing, and frankly, in the end, New York had got a bit too much for me. It was really harsh, and I found myself yearning for sort of a quieter pace. And so I decided I'm not going to go to Sydney, I'm going to stay here. And I'm glad I did. I love Newcastle. It's got a lot of creative people here, and it's got a real sort of something about it that's very friendly and very low-key, and I like that.
It's almost like a cocoon, I think, Newcastle.
It is a little. I think that's a good description. It is like that. You feel like that. You're protected by that. And I loved having the show at the Newcastle Art Gallery. You know, the way the show was curated was just excellent, and a really good experience.
Is that your first time having a retrospective of your work on display?
Yes.
What was it like seeing those sort of, you have those, you know, 3 distinct eras of your painting, and what was it like seeing them all together?
Well, it was actually very good, you know, because these are paintings that I'd sold. Some of them I've sold right after I did them. So I hadn't seen them in years, and you miss them, you know. So I actually really enjoyed it, and I particularly loved the way the show was curated.
Just going back to your Sky Space series, so Newcastle Art Gallery has a work from that series, Valonia. And this work is so beautifully sparse and bright in its qualities. Can you tell us about the technique that you developed to create that work?
Well, I had this vision of what I wanted, of sort of undulating colour. But the problem I predicted, which would happen with that, is when you have one colour blending into another, there's a sort of a stripe develops where those 2 colours meet. And I didn't want that. And I thought, how am I going to combat this? So I literally started, when I moved into my loft in Soho, it was a big, long brick wall in the loft, which I painted white and made it all clear. And I decided I was going to start on this really big canvas. So I started a 6-metre long canvas, and I was going to do this thing. I mean, it was just sort of, I was tempting myself to really work this out. And I had to learn how to do it. And basically, it was mixing little tiny pots of paint of slightly changing colour right across, and then I'd take sponges and brushes, big brushes, and brush it over until it blended in, and then move on to the next one and add a little dab of the next colour back into the original colour and right across the canvas. And when I think about it now, I'm not sure how I did it because it was very physical, because you couldn't stop. It was acrylic paint and you had to keep going, otherwise you'd get that band, that stripe. I put several layers on to sort of get a sort of a glow. And that one, Valonia, in the Newcastle Art Gallery is called, that's the Latin word for acorn. And there's a little piece of green in there, and I just wanted something like an acorn, something that's growing and bursting out, you know.
So you'd have to keep going. You couldn't let it dry, is that right?
Couldn't let it dry.
Yeah.
Couldn't let it dry because otherwise you'd get a stripe where one colour was meeting the other colour. You had to blend it in. They were about 2 metres high, so I had a little stool I would stand on, a little platform I would stand on to reach up. And to this day, I've got my elbow. It's just, I was doing this work, and as I say, it's amazing to me now that I was so patient with myself because to get it done.
How long would it take you to get across?
Probably about an hour and a half, working very quickly.
And then how many layers would be on?
Well, at that stage I had a lot of layers. I'd have anywhere between 20 and 50 layers just working across. And I did it in a way that, as I said, would blend evenly. And if it didn't blend evenly, sometimes I'd have to redo the colour a little tiny bit. I'd make a mistake about mixing it up, although I'm pretty good at mixing colour.
Newcastle Art Gallery holds 5 of your works in its collection, and one of your works in the collection, Centre of the Beginning, is a vibrant, swirling work that sits just over 4.5 metres wide, and I discovered it's one of the widest paintings in the gallery's collection. Why have you been so attracted to working on such large canvases across your career?
Well, funnily enough, because I love the look of large paintings, but I never had a problem with painting large. And so it was sort of like a freedom for me. I think for some people it's a sort of scary thing to do, but I found it a very free thing to give me a lot of space to work in. And for example, right now I'm working on some very small paintings, and I'm finding it quite hard to sort of diminish the idea back into a small space. So I love working on the big canvases.
Some people might find it really daunting to go
so
big.
Well, that's it. Some artists do. But I didn't find it daunting. I found there was a freedom. But Centre of the Beginning was the first time I went back into oil painting for years, because I'd studied art in using oil paints. And that was a big painting in oil paints. And it took me a long time. And that painting kept evolving and changing. It took me months and months to work it out. In fact, I say to people, there's another painting underneath that, because I virtually had changed the whole painting by the time I finished it. So I was working on it for a long, long time, and I wanted to finish it. I was getting impatient with myself. But that's what it took, you know.
You've said before that you're quite a slow painter.
Yes.
And what do you think that time allows you to develop?
Well, it's mainly evolving with the colour idea, because I get a colour and I sort of get a taste of a colour even in my mouth, just, you know, of the colour combinations. But sometimes it's not right for that particular painting. And that's what happened with Centre of the Beginning. I'd put things in there that just weren't right for that painting, but something that I wanted to say. But it just comes to me intuitively, and sometimes it's a very cerebral thing where I think about it or get a feeling for it before I put the colour down.
Another one of your works, Say, in the Newcastle Art Gallery collection, has a relationship to your mother. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, yes. Well, Say was in my studio in New York, and my mother saw it and loved it. And so I gave it to her, and she had it hanging in her house in North Sydney until she passed away. And then I wondered what to do with the painting, and I thought that it might be a great idea to donate it to the Newcastle Art Gallery, and for a double reason, and that is that my mother, being a botanical artist, when she was 85, she published a book called The Flower Seeker, and it was stories about 32 botanical drawings she did from islands all around Australia of indigenous plants. And that book was published, and then 32 drawings were in the Newcastle Library of Botanical Art.
Which is right
next door. So I thought it'd be rather nice to have the painting next door to her collection. So I was very glad when Newcastle agreed to take the painting on.
That's beautiful. Now, Virginia, we've come to our final question for our interview. If you could have dinner with any artist from the Newcastle Art Gallery collection, who would it be and why?
Well, there was an artist that I became familiar with his work only when I was having my survey exhibition at the Newcastle Art Gallery. And Lisa Kirkpatrick, the curator now, chose a small painting that they put in the front of the exhibition. When you first walk in the gallery, there's always a little juxtaposition of another artist showing. And it was a really sweet little wood block print, and it was so appropriate for my exhibition. It was abstract, and I totally connected to this painting, even though it wasn't like my work. And he's been termed as being a pop artist, but I don't quite see it like that, and I'd like to talk to him about it, about his work.
And that artist's name?
Is Kenji Kusaka.
And what would that dinner look like?
In terms of the food?
Yes. Would you cook or would you take him out?
I'd probably take him out these days rather than cook.
Well, Virginia, thank you so much for having us and telling us your stories. We are immensely honoured to have you as one of our collection artists and really enjoyed our conversation today.
Good. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Conversations from the Collection. If you'd like to know more about Virginia or her works in Newcastle Art Gallery's collection, there are links in the show notes, or you can visit the gallery's website at nag.org.au. I hope you will join us for next week's episode with celebrated Torres Strait Islander artist Brian Robinson.
I'm just a big kid, really. I'm, sort of surrounded in my house here by, Marvel figures and Star Wars figures. And it's that area of life that we all pop in and out of on occasion. I just live there constantly to create the work that I do. So.
Conversations from the Collection is a Newcastle Art Gallery podcast. This podcast is supported by the New South Wales Government through Create New South Wales. If you enjoyed listening, please like, subscribe, and share us with your friends.